splash echoed across the Rio Grande like a gunshot, and Sarah Hensley didn't hesitate before kicking off her boots and diving into the churning brown water after the terrified calf that had been swept away from its mother on the opposite bank. The year was 1878, and the summer heat had turned the Texas grasslands into fields of gold that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Sarah had been riding fence line on her father's ranch when she spotted the Hereford cow bellowing frantically at the river's edge, her calf struggling against the current that had grown stronger after 3 days of rain upstream. The water wasn't usually this wild, but spring runoff from the mountains had swollen the river to twice its normal width, and the little red and white calf was losing its battle against nature. Sarah's cotton dress billowed around her as she hit the water, the cold shock stealing her breath for just a moment before her strong strokes carried her forward. She had grown up on this land, swimming in this river since she was old enough to walk, and she knew every eddy and current like the lines on her own palm. The calf's terrified bawling grew louder as she closed the distance, its eyes rolling white with panic as it fought to keep its nose above the surface. She hadn't noticed the rider on the ridge above the river, hadn't seen the tall man in the black hat wheel his horse around and spur it down the embankment. Jake Morrison had been trailing a pair of stolen horses for 3 days, following tracks that led him across the border and back again, and he had stopped at the river to water his mount when he saw the woman throw herself into the dangerous current. His first thought was that she had lost her mind. His second thought, as he hit the water right behind her, was that he had apparently lost his too. The river tried to pull them both under, its fingers of current wrapping around their legs and tugging them downstream. Sarah reached the calf first, her fingers closing around the rope that still dangled from its neck. Someone's failed attempt to lead it across that had only made things worse. The animal thrashed against her, nearly knocking her under, and then suddenly there were strong hands on her waist steadying her, and a deep voice in her ear saying words she couldn't quite hear over the roar of the water. Jake had one arm around her middle, and the other reaching for the calf, and together they turned toward the near bank, fighting for every foot of progress. The current wanted to sweep them a quarter-mile downstream where the river narrowed and rushed through a rocky channel that would dash them all to pieces. Sarah kicked hard, her legs burning with effort, feeling the stranger's powerful strokes behind her as he essentially towed both her and the calf toward safety. Her feet found purchase on the muddy bottom first, and she stumbled forward, still gripping the rope, pulling the exhausted calf through the shallows. The cowboy was right beside her, his arm still steadying her until they collapsed together on the bank, the calf between them, all three of them gasping for air like landed fish. Sarah pushed her dark hair out of her eyes and looked at the man who had appeared out of nowhere to help her. He was maybe 25, a few years older than her own 22 years, with black hair plastered to his head and the kind of lean, hard build that came from years in the saddle. His gray eyes met hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke, just breathed heavily and stared at each other with the confusion of people who had just survived something they probably shouldn't have. "You always go swimming in your clothes?" he finally asked. And despite everything, Sarah found herself laughing. "Only when there's livestock involved," she managed, sitting up and checking the calf, which was already struggling to its feet with the resilience of youth. "You always follow strange women into rivers?" "First time," he admitted, getting to his feet and offering her his hand. She took it, feeling the calluses that marked him as a working man, someone who knew the weight of a rope and the pull of a stubborn horse. "Jake Morrison." "Sarah Hensley," she replied, looking across the river where the mother cow was still pacing frantically. "I need to get this baby back to her before she tries to cross herself." Jake followed her gaze and shook his head. "That current is still too strong. We were lucky once. I wouldn't try it again until tomorrow when the river calms down." Sarah knew he was right, but the sound of the cow's distress pulled at something deep in her chest. She had always been this way, her father said, too soft-hearted when it came to animals, too willing to risk herself for creatures that couldn't ask for help. It had gotten her into trouble more times than she could count, but she had never been able to change. had never wanted to. "My ranch is 2 miles south," she said, wringing out her skirt as much as she could. "I can keep the calf there overnight, bring it back in the morning when it's safer." "I'll ride with you," Jake offered, and something in his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. "Make sure you get home safe." Sarah opened her mouth to tell him she had been riding these trails alone since she was 12, that she could take care of herself just fine, but then she looked at him again and saw the genuine concern in his eyes, not the condescension she was used to from men who thought women were fragile things that needed protecting. This was different. This was the concern of one person for another who had just been through something dangerous together. "All right," she agreed, and was surprised to find she meant it. They rode back together, Sarah on her bay mare with the calf trotting alongside on a lead rope, and Jake on a big roan gelding that looked like it could run for days without tiring. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the whole world look like it was on fire. They didn't talk much on the ride, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came from two people who were content to simply exist in each other's presence without needing to fill every moment with words. The Hensley Ranch came into view as they crested a low rise, a sprawling collection of buildings centered around a 2-story house with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. There were corrals and barns, a bunkhouse for the hands, and beyond it all, thousands of acres of grassland dotted with cattle that looked like red and white stones from this distance. Sarah's father had built this place from nothing, had arrived in Texas 30 years ago with a wagon, a wife, and a dream, and had turned it into one of the most successful operations in the county. Thomas Hensley was standing on the porch when they rode in, and his weathered face creased into a frown when he saw his daughter's soaked dress and the strange cowboy riding beside her. He was a tall man, made taller by the hat he always wore, and his handlebar mustache twitched as Sarah dismounted and began explaining about the calf and the river and the rescue. "You dove into the Rio Grande in this current?" Thomas demanded, his voice rising. "Sarah Marie Hensley, you could have drowned." "But I didn't," Sarah replied calmly, used to her father's protective anger, "and the calf is fine. We'll take it back tomorrow." Thomas turned his attention to Jake, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the stranger. "And who might you be?" "Jake Morrison, sir," Jake said, dismounting and offering his hand. "I was passing by when I saw your daughter go into the water. Thought she might need a hand." "More like I saved him from drowning trying to save me," Sarah interjected with a slight smile, earning a surprised laugh from Jake. "It was more of a team effort," Jake admitted. Thomas shook Jake's hand, his grip firm and measuring. "Well, I'm grateful to you for helping my daughter, even if she was being foolish." He shot Sarah a look that said they would be discussing her recklessness later. "You'll stay for supper, of course. It's the least we can do." Jake hesitated, glancing at the lowering sun. "I don't want to impose." "Nonsense," Thomas said, his tone brooking no argument. "Maria always makes enough to feed an army. One more mouth won't make a difference. Besides, you need to dry out same as Sarah does." That was how Jake Morrison found himself sitting at the Hensley family table an hour later, wearing a borrowed shirt that belonged to one of the ranch hands while his own clothes dried by the fire. Maria, the ranch cook who had been with the family for 20 years, had outdone herself with a supper of beef stew, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and a peach pie that made Jake close his eyes in appreciation with the first bite. Sarah had changed into a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, which Jake found himself noticing more than he should. Her dark hair was still damp but braided neatly down her back, and she ate with the hearty appetite of someone who had burned a lot of energy that day. She caught him looking at her once and raised an eyebrow in question, and he quickly focused back on his plate, feeling heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the hot food. "So what brings you to this part of Texas?" Thomas asked, mopping up stew with a piece of bread. "You have the look of a man on a mission." Jake set down his fork, considering how much to share. "I'm tracking a pair of horses that were stolen from a ranch up near San Antonio. The trail led me this way. Lost the tracks at the river, though. I'll have to pick them up again tomorrow on the other side." "Horse thieves," Thomas said with disgust. "Lowest form of vermin there is. Whose horses?" "Mine," Jake said simply. Well, they were meant to be. I had just bought them, paid good money for a match pair of grays that I was planning to use for breeding stock. Someone cut them out of the pen the first night I had them and disappeared. I've been following them for 3 days now. Sarah leaned forward, interested. You're starting a horse ranch? That's the plan, Jake confirmed. I've been working on other people's ranches my whole life, saving every penny. Finally had enough to buy some land up near Austin and start my own operation. Those horses were supposed to be the foundation of my breeding program. He shook his head. But that doesn't matter much if I can't get them back. You'll find them, Sarah said with certainty. Anyone dedicated enough to track them for 3 days isn't going to give up now. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them. A recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, of two people who understood what it meant to fight for what mattered. Thomas watched the exchange with interest, his expression thoughtful. You're welcome to stay the night in the bunkhouse, Thomas offered. Get a fresh start in the morning. The river should be calmer by then anyway, and you'll have an easier crossing. Jake accepted gratefully, and after supper, Sarah walked him out to the bunkhouse where the ranch hands were settling in for the evening. The sky had turned deep purple, scattered with stars that looked close enough to touch, and the air had cooled to a comfortable temperature that made Sarah shiver slightly in her thin dress. Thank you, she said as they stopped outside the bunkhouse door. For today, I mean, in the river. You had it under control, Jake replied, which they both knew wasn't entirely true, but it was generous of him to say. Maybe, Sarah allowed, but it was nice not to be alone. Jake looked at her in the starlight, this woman who had thrown herself into a dangerous river without hesitation to save an animal, who laughed in the face of her father's anger, who looked at him like she could see straight through to whatever was inside him. He had met a lot of people in his 25 years, had worked alongside cowboys and ranch owners, had known dance hall girls and school teachers and every sort of person in between, but he had never met anyone quite like Sarah Hensley. I'm glad I was there, he said quietly. Sarah smiled, a soft expression that transformed her face from pretty to beautiful. Good night, Jake Morrison. Good night, Sarah. He watched her walk back to the house, her braid swinging between her shoulder blades, and felt something shift in his chest, a movement like tectonic plates rearranging themselves into a new configuration. He had come to Texas to track stolen horses, to start a new life on his own terms, to build something that was his. He hadn't come looking for anything else, certainly hadn't expected to find it, but as he lay in his bunk that night, listening to the snores of the other hands and staring at the dark ceiling, all he could think about was the way Sarah had looked at him across the dinner table, and the sound of her laugh when they'd collapsed on the riverbank, half drowned and fully alive. Morning came with the crow of a rooster and the smell of coffee and frying bacon drifting from the main house. Jake rose with the other hands, reclaimed his now dry clothes, and was washing up at the pump when Sarah appeared leading 2 horses, the calf trotting between them on a lead. Thought you might want company taking this little one back to its mama, she said by way of greeting. Jake dried his face on the towel hanging by the pump and studied her. She was wearing riding clothes today, practical split skirts and a cotton shirt, with her hair in a thick braid again, and a wide-brimmed hat shading her eyes. She looked fresh and rested and completely sure of herself, and Jake found himself nodding before he had consciously made the decision. Your father know you're coming with me? He knows I'm taking the calf back, Sarah replied, which wasn't quite an answer. They had breakfast with the family, and this time Jake met Sarah's younger brother, Daniel, who was 17, and full of questions about tracking and horse thieves and whether Jake had ever been in a gunfight. Jake answered patiently, amused by the boy's enthusiasm, and caught Sarah rolling her eyes fondly at her brother's eagerness. The ride to the river took less time in full daylight, and true to Jake's prediction, the water had calmed considerably overnight. It was still running faster than normal, but nothing like the dangerous current of the day before. The mother cow was exactly where they had left her, and she lowed frantically when she saw the calf on the opposite bank. I'll swim it across, Sarah said, already dismounting. We'll both go, Jake corrected, and she didn't argue. The water was cold in the morning air, but the crossing was uneventful, and the reunion between cow and calf was touching enough to make Sarah smile with satisfaction. They sat on the bank for a few minutes, letting their clothes drip dry in the warming sun, and watched as the calf nursed hungrily, its tail switching back and forth with contentment. "You think they're wild? Or do they belong to someone?" Jake asked, nodding at the pair. Sarah shaded her eyes and studied the cow more carefully. "That's a brand on her hip, but I can't make it out from here. Could be from the Martinez ranch. They run cattle on this side of the river. The calf must have wandered down to the water and gotten swept away when it tried to cross." "Your father wouldn't have been happy if you had let it drown," Jake observed. "My father wouldn't have been happy if I had drowned trying to save it," Sarah countered. "But yes, you're right. I couldn't have just watched it die." Jake understood that. He had always been the same way, the one who stopped to help the injured horse, who made sure the barn cats had enough to eat, who couldn't turn away from suffering even when it would have been easier to do so. It was a quality that had earned him respect from some people and mockery from others, but he had never been able to change it, had never wanted to. "I need to find where those tracks pick up again," he said reluctantly, knowing it was time to get back to his purpose. "But I'm glad I got to see you again." Sarah turned to look at him, her blue eyes serious. "Which way are you headed?" Jake pointed northwest. "The tracks were leading that direction before I lost them. There's rough country that way, lots of places to hide stolen horses." "That's near the old Patterson place," Sarah said thoughtfully. "It's been abandoned for 2 years now since old man Patterson died and his kids moved back east. Would be a good spot to lay low if you were running from the law or hiding stolen property." Jake sat up straighter. "How far?" "Maybe 10 miles as the crow flies, 15 by the trail. It's rough going, lots of rock and scrub." She paused, seeming to make a decision. "I could show you." "Sarah, I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking, I'm offering." She stood up, brushing off her split skirt. "Besides, you saved me yesterday. Consider it repayment." Jake wanted to argue that she didn't owe him anything, that he wouldn't feel right putting her in potential danger, but the truth was he could use a guide through unfamiliar country, and the thought of spending more time with her made something warm unfurl in his chest. "All right," he agreed, "but if there's any trouble, you stay back. I mean it." Sarah's smile was knowing. Of course. They rode northwest, their horses picking their way through increasingly rough terrain as the grassland gave way to rocky hills studded with mesquite and prickly pear. The sun climbed higher, beating down with the relentless heat of a Texas summer, and Jake was grateful when Sarah led them to a spring where they could water the horses and refill their canteens. They talked as they rode, the kind of meandering conversation that revealed more than either of them intended. Jake told her about growing up in Oklahoma, about his father who had died when Jake was 12, and left him to help his mother run a small farm that eventually failed. He told her about working his way across Texas, learning horses from anyone who would teach him, saving money $1 at a time until he finally had enough to buy land of his own. Sarah told him about growing up on the ranch, about her mother who had died of fever when Sarah was 8, about learning to ride before she could properly walk, and how she had always preferred the company of horses to people. She told him about the school in San Antonio where her father had sent her to become a lady, and how she had lasted exactly 1 term before running away and riding the 100 miles home, arriving muddy and exhausted and completely unrepentant. "My father gave up trying to make me into something I'm not after that," she said with a laugh. "Decided it was easier to just let me be myself." "Smart man," Jake replied, and meant it. They found the tracks around midday, the clear prints of 2 horses heading almost exactly where Sarah had predicted. Jake dismounted and studied them carefully, confirming they matched the shoes he had seen back at the starting point of this chase. "These are them," he said with satisfaction. "Fresh too, maybe 6, 8 hours old." "Then they're at the Patterson place," Sarah said with certainty, "or they were. Come on." They approached the abandoned ranch cautiously, leaving the horses tied in a grove of cottonwoods and creeping forward on foot. The buildings were in disrepair, the house missing half its roof and the barn leaning at a dangerous angle, but there was smoke rising from the chimney of what had once been the foreman's cabin, and 2 gray horses were visible in the collapsing corral. Jake's hands clenched into fists at the sight of his horses, and he had to force himself to think clearly rather than just charging in. There could be 1 man in that cabin or 5, and going in blind was a good way to get himself killed. "I'm going to circle around, see if I can get a count of how many people are in there," he whispered to Sarah. "You stay here." "Like hell," Sarah breathed back. "2 sets of eyes are better than 1. Jake wanted to argue but knew it would be pointless. Instead, he just nodded and they split up, him going left and her going right, working their way around the property while staying in cover. Jake spotted the man first, sitting on the cabin porch, whittling a piece of wood with a large knife. He was young, maybe 20, with a scraggly beard and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with what he was doing. Jake worked his way back to where Sarah was waiting and found her crouched behind a water trough. "Just one that I can see," he reported quietly. "Young guy, armed, but doesn't look too experienced." "I didn't see anyone else," Sarah confirmed. "Could be more inside, but I don't think so. Place only has 2 rooms and there's only 1 horse in addition to yours." Jake nodded, thinking. The smart thing would be to ride back to town, get the sheriff, do this legally. But that would take the better part of a day, and by then the thief could be long gone with Jake's horses. He had worked too hard and come too far to let that happen. "I'm going to walk up and talk to him," Jake decided. "Confront him direct. If he runs, I'll chase him. If he fights, well, I'll deal with that too." "And what am I supposed to do while you're being heroic?" Sarah asked dryly. "Stay here and be ready to ride for help if things go wrong," Jake replied, knowing even as he said it that she wouldn't listen. He was right. When he walked out of cover with his hands visible but near his gun, Sarah was right behind him, carrying a rifle she had pulled from her saddle scabbard. The young man on the porch jumped to his feet, his knife clattering to the boards. "Those are my horses," Jake said without preamble, nodding toward the corral. "I have the bill of sale to prove it. You can either come with me to the sheriff peacefully, or we can do this the hard way." The thief looked between Jake and Sarah, clearly doing calculations about his chances. For a long moment, Jake thought he might actually go for his gun, and his own hand tensed, ready to draw. But then the young man's shoulders slumped, and he shook his head. "They ain't worth dying over," he muttered. "Man paid me $50 to steal them and bring them here. Said he'd be back yesterday to pick them up, but he never showed. I should have known better than to trust Gus Ramsey." "Gus Ramsey?" Jake repeated, the name meaning nothing to him. "Known horse thief," Sarah supplied, her rifle still trained on the young man. "Operates all over this part of Texas. If he hired someone to steal your horses, he probably had a buyer lined up." "Well, he won't be collecting on this sale," Jake said grimly. He gestured to the thief. "Get your horse and ride out. If I see you again, I'll shoot first and ask questions later." The young man didn't need to be told twice. He disappeared into the cabin, emerged with a saddlebag, and was on his horse and galloping away within 2 minutes, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Sarah lowered her rifle and looked at Jake. "You let him go." "He was just some kid making bad choices, ridiculous," Jake replied, walking toward the corral and his horses. "Probably needed the money. Besides, it's Ramsey I want, not him." Sarah followed, watching as Jake inspected both horses carefully, checking them over for injuries or signs of mistreatment. They were fine. A little dusty, but otherwise none the worse for their adventure. And they nickered softly at Jake's familiar touch. "You're a good man, Jake Morrison," Sarah said quietly. Jake looked at her over the back of one of the gray horses, surprised by the emotion in her voice. "I'm just a man trying to do right." "That's what makes you good," she replied. They rode back to the Cottonwood Grove, collected their own horses, and started the long ride back to the Hensley Ranch with Jake's recovered horses on lead ropes. The sun was starting its afternoon descent, and Jake knew he should probably head north toward his own land, get back to the work of building his ranch and his life. But the thought of leaving Sarah, of riding away and possibly never seeing her again, made his chest tight with something that felt like panic. "I should get these horses home," he said, not quite managing to make it sound like he meant it. "You should," Sarah agreed, her voice carefully neutral. They rode in silence for a while. the only sounds the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves on hard-packed earth. Jake tried to think of something to say, some reason to stay or to see her again, but everything that came to mind sounded foolish or presumptuous. He had known this woman for exactly one day. He had no right to the feelings that were tangling themselves around his heart like morning glory vines. "My father is having a barn dance 2 weeks from Saturday," Sarah said suddenly, not looking at him, "to celebrate the end of the spring roundup. There will be music and food, and half the county will be there." Jake's heart kicked hard against his ribs. "Is that so?" "It is," Sarah confirmed. "It would be a shame if you couldn't make it. After all, my father would want to make sure you got properly thanked for helping me in the river." "Wouldn't want to disappoint your father," Jake said, unable to keep the smile out of his voice. "No, you wouldn't," Sarah agreed, finally turning to look at him, and the expression in her eyes made Jake's breath catch. They reached the Hensley ranch as the sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Thomas came out to meet them, and Jake explained about finding the horses and the young thief who had run off. Thomas listened, asked pointed questions about Gus Ramsey, and looked thoughtful when Jake finished. "Ramsey is bad news," Thomas said, "but he's also careful. Hard to catch him in the act. If you're serious about getting justice, you might want to talk to Sheriff Cordell in town. He's been after Ramsey for years." Jake nodded, filing the information away. "I'll do that. But for now, I should get these horses home. I've been gone long enough." Thomas shook his hand firmly. "You're welcome here any time, Morrison. You helped my daughter, and you handled that situation today with more restraint than most men would have shown. That speaks well of your character." "Thank you, sir," Jake replied, genuinely touched. He said goodbye to Daniel and Maria, and then finally turned to Sarah, who had been standing quietly to one side. She walked with him to where his horses were waiting, and they stood there for a moment, neither quite sure what to say. 2 weeks from Saturday," Sarah reminded him. "I'll be here," Jake promised. "Good," she said simply. And then, before he could second-guess himself, Jake leaned down and kissed her cheek, a brief, warm touch that made Sarah's breath hitch. "Until then," he said, and swung into his saddle before he could do something really foolish like kiss her properly, which was absolutely what he wanted to do. He rode away without looking back, because he knew if he did, he might not leave at all. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of Jake's life. He threw himself into work on his new property, building corrals and repairing the small house that had come with the land, working until his muscles screamed and exhaustion dragged him into sleep each night. But even work couldn't keep his mind from wandering to Sarah, to the way she had looked in the starlight, to her laugh and her courage and the fierce determination in her eyes when she had backed him up against the horse thief. He cleaned up the place as best he could, wanting to have something to show for himself when he saw her again. The house was small, just 3 rooms and a porch, but it was solid, and the roof didn't leak. He fixed the corrals, cut back the mesquite that was trying to reclaim the cleared land, and started planning where he would build a proper barn once he had the money. The gray horses settled in well, and Jake spent hours working with them, starting the patient process of training that would eventually make them valuable breeding stock. They were good animals, well-formed and intelligent, and watching them move around the corral, Jake felt the first real stirrings of pride in what he was building. This was his, earned by his own work, and no one could take it from him. But at night, lying in his bedroll and watching stars through the open window, all he could think about was Sarah. Saturday finally arrived, and Jake spent the morning making himself presentable. He bathed in the creek, shaved carefully, and put on his best shirt and pants, the ones he had been saving for special occasions. He looked at himself in the small mirror propped on his dresser and hoped he looked like the kind of man Sarah Hensley might want to dance with. The ride to the Hensley ranch took 3 hours, and Jake arrived to find the place transformed. Lanterns hung from every available surface, casting warm golden light across the yard, where what looked like half of Texas had gathered. A band was set up on the porch, fiddles and guitars filling the air with lively music, and people were dancing in the cleared space in front of the barn. their shadows long in the lantern light. Jake dismounted and handed his horse off to one of the hands who was managing the temporary corral set up for guests. His heart was pounding like he was heading into a gunfight, and he wiped his palms on his pants before walking toward the house. He spotted Sarah almost immediately, standing with a group of women near the punch table, and his breath caught at the sight of her. She was wearing a green dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and her dark hair was loose around her shoulders for the first time since he had met her, falling in soft waves down her back. She was laughing at something one of the other women had said, and the sound carried across the yard, making Jake smile without meaning to. As if she felt his gaze, Sarah turned, and their eyes met across the crowded yard. Her face lit up with a smile that made Jake feel like he could fly, and she excused herself from her companions, walking toward him with a grace that made his mouth go dry. "You came," she said, and he could hear the relief in her voice, like maybe she had been worried he wouldn't. "I promised," Jake replied. "Besides, I wanted to see you again." Sarah's smile grew wider. "I wanted to see you too." They stood there smiling at each other like fools until Thomas appeared, clapping Jake on the shoulder and welcoming him warmly. Jake met what felt like 100 people, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, but the whole time he was aware of Sarah beside him, her presence like a warm current running through his awareness. When the band struck up a waltz, Jake turned to her and offered his hand. "Dance with me?" "I thought you would never ask," Sarah replied, placing her hand in his. They moved onto the makeshift dance floor, and Jake took her in his arms, one hand at her waist and the other holding hers. For a moment they just stood there, adjusting to the feel of each other, and then the music swept them away and they were turning in time to the waltz, moving together like they had been dancing together for years. Jake wasn't a particularly skilled dancer, but he knew the basic steps, and Sarah followed his lead easily, her body light and responsive against his. They didn't talk, just moved to the music, and Jake felt something settle into place inside him, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. "I missed you," Sarah said softly, so quietly he almost didn't hear her over the music. "I missed you too," Jake admitted, tightening his hand at her waist just slightly. "I tried not to think about you, told myself I was being foolish, that I barely knew you. Didn't work." "I'm glad," Sarah said, looking up at him with eyes that held the stars. "I did the same thing. Also didn't work." When the waltz ended, they reluctantly separated, but Jake kept finding his way back to her throughout the evening. They danced more waltzes, a reel that left them both breathless and laughing, and a slow ballad that let Jake hold her close and pretend, just for a few minutes, that they were the only two people in the world. Between dances, they ate barbecue and cornbread, drank lemonade, and talked about everything and nothing. Jake met Sarah's friends, and while some of the young men looked at him with barely concealed jealousy, no one challenged his presence at Sarah's side. It was clear to anyone with eyes that something was growing between them, a connection that was as undeniable as it was new. As the evening wore on and the crowd began to thin, Jake and Sarah found themselves walking away from the lights and noise, drifting toward the corrals where it was quieter. The moon was nearly full, painting everything in silver, and the warm night air smelled of dust and horses and the wild sage that grew on the hills. "I don't want this night to end," Sarah said, leaning against the corral fence and looking up at the stars. Jake stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Neither do I." "When will I see you again?" "When do you want to see me again?" Jake countered. Sarah turned to look at him, her expression serious. "Tomorrow. And the day after that. And every day after that, if I'm being honest." Jake's heart hammered in his chest. "Sarah, I don't have much to offer you. Just a small ranch and a lot of hard work ahead of me. I can't give you fancy dresses or a big house or any of the things a woman like you deserves." "A woman like me," Sarah repeated, shaking her head. "Jake, you don't understand. I don't want fancy dresses or a big house. I want someone who sees me, really sees me, not some idea of what a woman should be. I want someone who understands why I dove into that river and doesn't try to change me. I want someone who looks at stolen horses and sees more than property, who lets a scared kid go instead of dragging him to jail." She reached out and took his hand. "I want someone like you." Jake looked down at their joined hands, his calloused and scarred from years of hard work, hers smaller but just as strong, and felt something give way inside him like a dam breaking and releasing everything he had been holding back. "I'm falling in love with you," he said, the words coming out raw and honest. "I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other, but I can't help it. You're all I think about." "It's not too soon," Sarah said fiercely, "and you're all I think about too. I'm falling in love with you too, Jake Morrison, and I don't care if it's crazy or foolish or too fast. It feels right, and I'm tired of pretending it doesn't." Jake pulled her closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "I want to court you proper, do this right. But I need you to know that when I look at you, I see my future. I see a partner and a life and everything I've been working toward without even knowing it." "Then court me," Sarah whispered, her breath warm against his palm. "Come visit me, write me letters, bring me flowers if you want. Do all the proper things, but know that my answer is already yes. Yes to whatever you're asking. Yes to wherever this is going. Yes to you." Jake kissed her then properly this time, his lips finding hers in the moonlight while the distant sounds of the party continued behind them. Sarah melted against him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck, and Jake felt like his heart might burst from the sheer rightness of it, the perfect feeling of her in his arms where she belonged. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "Your father is going to shoot me." Sarah laughed, the sound joyful and free. "My father likes you. He told me so this morning. Said you were the kind of man he had hoped I would find, someone solid and honest and brave." "He said that?" "He did," Sarah confirmed. "He also said if you hurt me, he would hunt you down and make you regret it, but I think that's just standard father talk." Jake laughed, relief and happiness bubbling up inside him like champagne. "I would never hurt you. I would rather die." "I know," Sarah said simply, and kissed him again. They walked back to the party hand in hand, and if anyone noticed the slight dishevelment of Sarah's hair or the dazed expression on Jake's face, they were polite enough not to mention it. Thomas caught Jake's eye from across the yard and gave him a small nod, which Jake took as approval or at least acceptance. When it was finally time for Jake to leave, with the moon high overhead and most of the guests already departed, Sarah walked him to his horse. Jake kissed her one more time, soft and sweet, and promised to come back in 3 days. "I have to go into town for supplies," he explained, "but after that I'll come straight here." "I'll be waiting," Sarah promised. Jake rode away reluctantly, looking back twice to see Sarah standing in the yard, silhouetted against the lamplight from the house, watching him go. His heart felt too big for his chest, and he couldn't stop smiling, even though there was no one around to see it. He was in love. Completely, utterly, impossibly in love with Sarah Hensley, and the miracle was that she loved him back. The next few months passed in a blur of work and courtship, Jake splitting his time between building up his ranch and spending every spare moment with Sarah. He rode to the Hensley place twice a week, sometimes more if he could manage it, and they spent long hours riding the range together, talking about their dreams and plans, stealing kisses when they thought no one was watching. Thomas gave them space but kept a watchful eye, and Jake made sure to always be respectful, to always bring Sarah home before dark, to always treat her with the honor she deserved. He wanted Thomas to know he was serious, that this wasn't some passing fancy but a real and true love that he intended to honor for the rest of his life. Sarah helped him with the ranch when she could, offering advice on breeding stock and ranch management that proved invaluable. She had grown up in this world and knew it inside and out, and Jake quickly came to rely on her judgment as much as his own. They were partners in every sense of the word, equal and complementary, each bringing strengths that balance the other's weaknesses. By the time autumn arrived, painting the Texas hills in shades of gold and red, Jake knew it was time. He had saved enough money to buy a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that had taken every spare penny he had, and he carried it in his pocket for a week before he finally worked up the courage to ask. He planned it carefully, wanting the moment to be special. He invited Sarah to ride out to his ranch, ostensibly to see the new barn he had been building. She arrived on a crisp October morning, the air cool enough to make her cheeks flush pink, and Jake's heart hammered as he helped her dismount. "The barn looks wonderful," Sarah said, walking around the new structure that Jake had finished just 2 days before. "You did all this yourself?" "Had some help from a couple of hired hands," Jake admitted, "but mostly yes. I wanted to get it done before winter." They walked through the barn, Sarah admiring the sturdy construction and the spacious stalls, and then Jake led her out back to where a small pond reflected the blue sky like a mirror. He had set up a picnic there, a blanket and basket of food, and Sarah's eyes lit up when she saw it. "Jake Morrison, are you trying to woo me?" she teased. "Yes," he said honestly, "and is it working?" "It was working the day you dove into the river after me," Sarah replied, sitting on the blanket and patting the space beside her. They ate lunch, talking and laughing as they always did, and then Jake took a deep breath and reached into his pocket. His hand was shaking slightly as he pulled out the small velvet box, and Sarah's eyes went wide when she saw it. "Sarah Hensley," Jake said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I know we haven't known each other long by some people's standards, but I also know that I have never been more sure of anything in my life than I am about this. You are my partner, my best friend, the person I want to see every morning and fall asleep beside every night. You make me laugh, you challenge me to be better, and you see me for who I really am. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much. Will you marry me?" He opened the box, revealing the ring, and Sarah pressed her hands to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Jake slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and then Sarah was in his arms, kissing him and crying and laughing all at once. Jake held her tight, feeling like he might float away from pure happiness if he didn't anchor himself to her. "I love you so much," Sarah said against his chest. "I can't believe this is real." "It's real," Jake promised. "I'm real, you're real, this is real, and we're going to have the most amazing life together." They lay back on the blanket, Sarah's head on Jake's shoulder and his arm around her, watching clouds drift across the perfect blue sky. They talked about the future, about the ranch they would build together, about the children they hoped to have someday, about growing old together on this land they both loved. "When should we tell your father?" Jake asked eventually. "Tonight," Sarah said decisively. "I want the whole world to know." Thomas took the news well, shaking Jake's hand firmly and pulling Sarah into a tight hug. "I knew this was coming," he admitted. "You two have been mooning over each other for months. I'm happy for you both." They set the wedding for December, wanting to give themselves time to prepare, but not willing to wait any longer than necessary. Sarah and Maria threw themselves into planning, and Jake worked on finishing the house, adding a second bedroom, and making improvements that would make it more comfortable for Sarah. The wedding was held at the Hensley Ranch on a cold December afternoon with half the county in attendance. Sarah wore a white dress that Maria had helped her sew, and she looked so beautiful walking down the makeshift aisle on her father's arm that Jake felt tears prick his eyes. They exchanged vows in front of a traveling preacher, promising to love and honor each other for all the days of their lives. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed Sarah with all the love and promise in his heart. The celebration lasted well into the night, with dancing and food and speeches that made both Jake and Sarah laugh and cry. When they finally left for Jake's ranch, their ranch now, riding together in a wagon decorated with ribbons and tin cans, Jake felt like the luckiest man alive. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, a coming together that felt like the natural conclusion to everything that had been building between them. They lay tangled together afterward, Sarah's head on Jake's chest and his fingers trailing through her hair, and talked in whispers about how perfect everything was, how right it felt to finally be husband and wife. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. Sarah moved to the ranch permanently, and together they worked to make it a success. She proved to be just as skilled and hardworking as Jake had known she would be, and her knowledge of horses and cattle made her an invaluable partner. They bought more breeding stock, built more corrals, and slowly, steadily, the ranch began to prosper. There were hard times too, of course. A drought the first summer tested them, and they had to work hard to keep the animals watered and healthy. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher over property lines that got heated before cooler heads prevailed. There were injuries and illness, the thousand small difficulties that came with ranching life. But through it all, they had each other. When Jake was discouraged, Sarah was there to remind him how far they had come. When Sarah was exhausted, Jake was there to shoulder the burden and tell her to rest. They argued sometimes, as all couples do, but they always talked it through, always found their way back to understanding and compromise. The following spring, Sarah told Jake she was pregnant. He had been working on the barn roof when she came out to tell him, and he nearly fell off the ladder in his excitement. He climbed down quickly and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and told him to be careful. "We're going to have a baby," she said, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "We're going to have a baby," Jake repeated, hardly able to believe it. He placed his hand on her still flat stomach, trying to imagine the life growing there, and felt overwhelmed with love and protectiveness. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Jake found himself becoming ridiculously protective, worrying whenever Sarah did anything more strenuous than sitting down. Sarah tolerated his hovering with good-natured patience, reminding him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was hardly the first pregnant rancher's wife. "I'm not made of glass," she told him when he tried to stop her from riding. I'm pregnant, not dying." "I know," Jake said sheepishly. "I just worry." "I know you do," Sarah replied, kissing his cheek. "And I love you for it. But you have to let me live my life. I promise I'll be careful." Their son was born on a cold November night, arriving in a rush with Maria attending as midwife, and Jake pacing a hole in the floor of their small living room. When Maria finally called him in to meet his child, Jake entered the bedroom with shaking hands to find Sarah propped up against the pillows, tired but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Meet your son," she said softly, and Jake sank down on the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch the impossibly small hand that peeked out of the blanket. "He's perfect," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're perfect. I can't believe he's ours." They named him William, after Jake's father, and called him Will. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, and Jake had never known love could expand the way it did when he looked at his son. He had thought his heart was full with Sarah, but somehow it grew to encompass this new little person too, this tiny human that was half him and half the woman he loved more than life itself. Will grew quickly, and soon the small house echoed with the sounds of a toddler, the laughter and occasional crying and endless questions that came with a curious child. Sarah proved to be a wonderful mother, patient and loving, but also firm when she needed to be, teaching Will respect and kindness along with his letters and numbers. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Jake's breeding program was proving successful, and people from 3 counties over were coming to buy horses from them. They hired additional hands, expanded the house again to add more bedrooms, built a proper stable that was the envy of their neighbors. When Will was 3, Sarah told Jake she was pregnant again. This time, Jake managed to control his protective instincts a bit better, trusting Sarah to know her own limits. Their daughter Emily was born on a warm spring morning, arriving so quickly that Maria barely had time to prepare. She was tiny and perfect, with her mother's blue eyes and her father's dark hair, and Will was immediately smitten with his little sister. Life fell into an even fuller rhythm then, the days passing in a blur of work and childcare, of training horses and teaching Will to ride, of late nights with a fussy baby and early mornings with a toddler full of energy. It was exhausting and wonderful, and everything Jake had ever wanted without knowing how to ask for it. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Will grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved horses as much as his parents did, spending hours in the stables learning everything Jake could teach him. Emily was more wild, a daredevil who reminded Jake so much of Sarah that it made his heart ache. She was always climbing things she shouldn't, always pushing boundaries, always testing to see what she could get away with. When Will was 7 and Emily was 4, Sarah's father passed away peacefully in his sleep. It was a blow to all of them, but especially to Sarah, who had been close to her father. Thomas left the ranch to Sarah and Daniel to split, but Daniel had already made plans to move west to California, so Sarah bought out his half, and suddenly they found themselves managing 2 large ranches. It was more work than either of them had anticipated, but they rose to the challenge. Jake hired a foreman to manage the day-to-day operations at the old Hensley place while they continued to live on and run their original ranch. It meant longer hours and more responsibility, but it also meant security for their children and the ability to build something truly lasting. More years passed, bringing new challenges and new joys. Jake's hair started to gray at the temples, and Sarah developed laugh lines around her eyes that Jake loved to kiss. They added a 3rd child to their family, another son they named Thomas after Sarah's father, and their house rang with the sounds of children and life and love. Through it all, through every hardship and every triumph, Jake never forgot the day he had seen a woman dive into a river to save a drowning calf, and how he had followed her without thinking. It had been the best decision of his life, that split-second choice to go after her, because it had led him to everything that mattered. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Jake and Sarah rode out to the spot by the Rio Grande where they had first met. It was summer again, hot and bright, and the river ran clear and calm, nothing like the dangerous current it had been that day 2 decades before. They sat on the bank together, Sarah leaning against Jake's chest with his arms around her, watching their oldest son Will, now 17 and nearly a man, working with a young horse in the distance. Emily, 14 and beautiful, was helping her younger brother Thomas with his reading lessons on the porch of the house. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked, pressing a kiss to Sarah's temple. "Marrying me, leaving the life you could have had?" Sarah turned to look at him, her blue eyes still as bright and full of life as they had been the day they met. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single second. You gave me everything I ever wanted, Jake Morrison. Adventure and partnership and a love that makes every day better than the last. Why would I regret that?" "I just want to make sure you're happy," Jake said softly. "I'm more than happy," Sarah replied. "I'm complete. You complete me, our children complete me, this life we built together completes me. I dove into that river to save a calf, but you saved me. You saved me from a life half lived, from settling for less than what I deserved. You gave me everything." Jake held her tighter, his throat tight with emotion. "You gave me everything too. Before you, I was just drifting, working towards something I couldn't quite name. You gave me purpose and meaning and a reason to build something that would last. You're my everything, Sarah. You always have been from the moment I saw you disappear into that water." They sat there until the sun started to set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and then they rode home together, hand in hand, even though they were on separate horses, the way they had been riding through life for 20 years. The ranch continued to thrive under their joint management. Will eventually took over most of the day-to-day operations, proving himself to be a skilled and thoughtful rancher who had learned well from his parents. Emily surprised everyone by developing a passion for horse training, and her reputation for being able to gentle even the most difficult horses spread far and wide. Thomas, the youngest, showed an aptitude for the business side of things, keeping their books and managing sales with a skill that impressed even the most hardened traders. Jake and Sarah gradually stepped back from the heavy labor of ranching, though they never fully retired. They were always there to offer advice and guidance, to help with the difficult births and the emergency situations, But they also allowed their children to make their own decisions and occasionally their own mistakes. They took time to travel a bit, something they had never been able to do when they were younger and building the ranch. They rode up to Colorado to see the mountains, traveled east to see the ocean, spent a month in San Antonio just enjoying each other's company without the constant demands of work. But they always came home to the ranch, to the land they had built their life on, to the place where their love had grown and flourished. It was in their blood, part of who they were, and neither could imagine living anywhere else. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that rivaled their original wedding celebration. The whole county turned out, and there was dancing and food and speeches that made both Jake and Sarah cry and laugh in equal measure. Their grandchildren, 3 so far with more on the way, ran wild through the crowds, and Jake watched them with a heart full of pride and love. "We did good," Sarah said, standing beside him and watching their family. "Look at all this, Jake. Look at what we built." Jake pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "We did better than good. We did amazing." As the party wound down and the stars came out overhead, Jake led Sarah out to the barn, to a quiet corner where they could be alone for a few minutes. He had something he wanted to give her, something he had been working on in secret for months. "Close your eyes," he instructed, and Sarah complied with an amused smile. Jake retrieved the package he had hidden and placed it in her hands. "Okay, open them." Sarah looked down at the flat package wrapped in brown paper and carefully unwrapped it to reveal a framed drawing. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at, and then her breath caught. It was a drawing of the two of them, younger versions captured in charcoal and paper, swimming in a river with a calf between them. Jake had commissioned it from an artist in town, describing the scene in such detail that the man had been able to capture it perfectly. There was Sarah with her hair streaming behind her, determination on her face, and Jake right behind her, one arm outstretched to help. The artist had caught the movement and the danger and the absolute rightness of that moment when two people had come together to do something brave. "Jake," Sarah breathed, tears streaming down her face, "and this is beautiful." "That's where our story started," Jake said, his own voice thick with emotion. "That's the moment that led to everything else. I wanted to capture it, to remember it always." Sarah set the picture down carefully and threw her arms around Jake's neck, kissing him with all the passion and love of their 30 years together. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I love you so much it still takes my breath away sometimes." "I love you too," Jake replied. "Always and forever." They hung the picture in their bedroom where they could see it every day, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. It became a favorite of their grandchildren, who would ask to hear the story of how Grandma and Grandpa met, and Jake and Sarah would tell it together, trading off details and laughing at the memories. As they grew older, their hair turning white and their steps slowing, Jake and Sarah remained as devoted to each other as they had been from the beginning. They held hands when they walked, still kissed each other goodbye every morning, still found reasons to laugh and reasons to marvel at the life they had built together. Jake's health started to decline when he was in his early 70s, his heart growing weak after a lifetime of hard work. The doctor said there wasn't much they could do, and Jake accepted it with the same quiet grace he had approached everything else in his life. He wasn't afraid of dying, he told Sarah. He had lived a full and wonderful life, had loved and been loved in return, had built something lasting. What more could a man ask for? But he didn't die, not then. He rallied, growing stronger through sheer force of will and Sarah's devoted care. They had a few more good years where they could still ride out together, still work with the horses, still watch their great-grandchildren being born and growing. It was on a warm spring morning with the wildflowers blooming across the hills and the air sweet with the smell of new grass that Jake finally passed peacefully in his sleep. Sarah was beside him holding his hand, and she felt the moment he slipped away, his spirit finally releasing its hold on his worn-out body. The funeral was huge, people coming from all over Texas to pay their respects to a man who had been respected and loved by everyone who knew him. Sarah stood strong through it all, accepting condolences with grace, comforted by her children and grandchildren and the knowledge that Jake had lived exactly the life he wanted. But at night, alone in their bed, she felt the loss like a physical ache, a hole in her heart that could never be filled. They had been together for over 50 years, had built a life and a family and a legacy that would continue long after they were both gone, but none of that made the missing any easier. She visited his grave every day, bringing fresh flowers and talking to him like he was still there to listen. She told him about the ranch, about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about the deals Will was making and the horses Emily was training. She told him she loved him, that she missed him, that she couldn't wait to see him again. Sarah lived for 5 more years after Jake passed, staying active and involved in the ranch until the very end. She got to meet 2 more great-grandchildren, got to see Will's son take over as foreman, got to watch Emily's daughter win a major horse competition. She lived long enough to know that everything they had built would continue, that their legacy was secure. She passed away in her sleep on a summer morning, exactly 56 years to the day after she had first met Jake Morrison. Her children found her with a smile on her face, and on her nightstand was the framed picture of 2 young people swimming in a river, saving a calf and finding each other. They buried her next to Jake, and at the funeral, their oldest grandson read from a letter Sarah had written years before to be opened after her death. In it, she talked about the day she had seen a calf struggling in the Rio Grande and made the split-second decision to dive in after it. She talked about the cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere, who had jumped in right behind her without hesitation. She talked about falling in love, about building a life together, about the joy and the challenges and the absolute perfection of a love that had lasted a lifetime. We saved that calf, Sarah had written. But really, we saved each other. Jake gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams, and I hope I gave him the same. If I could go back and do it all again, I wouldn't change a single thing. Every moment was worth it. Every challenge was worth overcoming, because it led me to him and to the life we built together. That's what love is, I think. Not just the big moments, but the million small ones in between. The shared work and shared dreams and shared laughter. The quiet evenings and the exciting adventures and the simple act of existing together. Jake was my partner, my best friend, my great love, and I was blessed beyond measure to have him in my life. If you're reading this, remember that love is worth fighting for, worth diving into rivers for, worth building a whole life around. Find your person, and when you do, hold on tight and never let go. That's the secret to everything. The letter was passed around the family, read and reread, and eventually framed and hung in the main house of the ranch that still bore the Morrison name. Generations of children grew up hearing the story of how their great-great-grandparents met, of the calf in the river, and the cowboy who dove in right behind the brave woman who was trying to save it. The ranch continued to prosper, passed down through the family as Jake and Sarah had always intended. And sometimes, on quiet summer mornings when the light hit the Rio Grande just right, people swore they could see 2 figures in the water, swimming side by side, forever young and forever together, still saving calves and still saving each other, bound by a love that death itself couldn't diminish. Their story became legend in that part of Texas, told and retold until it was hard to separate fact from fiction. But the heart of it remained true. The simple and profound truth that sometimes love appears when you least expect it, when you're too busy being brave and selfless to notice it sneaking up on you. And when it does, the only thing to do is dive in head first and trust that someone will be right behind you, ready to share the journey ahead. The Morrison Ranch stood for over 100 years, a testament to the love and hard work of 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. And every generation that worked that land, that rode those fences and trained those horses and watched the sun set over those Texas hills, knew they were standing on ground consecrated by a love story for the ages. A story that had started with a splash and a brave woman and a cowboy who didn't hesitate to follow her into danger. Because that's what love is, really. It's seeing someone heading into the unknown and choosing to go with them, trusting that together you can face whatever comes. It's the decision made in a split second that changes everything. The leap of faith that leads to a lifetime of moments both ordinary and extraordinary. It's two people deciding that whatever happens, they'll face it side by side, come what may. Jake Morrison and Sarah Hensley had understood that from the very beginning, from the moment their eyes met on that riverbank with a terrified calf between them. And they had lived that truth every day of their lives together, building something beautiful and lasting out of that single moment of shared courage. Their love story ended the way all love stories must, with death and separation and grief. But it also never ended at all, because love like theirs doesn't die. It lives on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carry their blood and their values. It lives on in the land they worked and the buildings they built and the legacy they left behind. It lives on in the story itself, passed down through generations, inspiring others to be brave, to take chances, to dive in when someone needs help, to open their hearts to love when it appears. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Jake and Sarah Morrison were together again, young and whole and happy, riding through fields of wildflowers under an endless blue sky, with all the time in the world to enjoy the love they had found and nurtured and cherished through every moment of their remarkable lives together.